In late 2005, Bodie issued its first report showing DNA profiles of genetic material found on the victims and on other pieces of evidence from the crime scene. The lab was later given DNA samples both from the victims and the defendants. It analyzed those. In the end, none of the Bodie reports could link any of the DNA provided by the defendants to the victims or to the crime scene. And in fact, and this is of great importance, one report showed a piece of genetic material on the penis of Stephen Branch that could not be linked to any victim or to any defendant. In the meantime, our investigators were obtaining DNA samples in the form of hair, cigarette butts, oral swabs from people who had some connection to the events. These included samples from several people, including Stephen Branch's stepfather, Terry Hobbs. And later we received a sample voluntarily given by David Jacoby, a friend of Terry Hobbs who was with Terry Hobbs on the day Stephen disappeared. We gave all these samples to Thomas Fedor, who's here today. He's an independent forensic serologist at the Serological Research Institute in California. Tom analyzed the samples and compared them to the testing results Bodie had already given us. The result of that analysis in May 2007 showed that a hair from a ligature used to tie up Michael Moore could be associated with Terry Hobbs. We provided that result to the prosecution right after learning of it. A much more recent analysis by Mr. Fedor showed that a hair found on a tree root or a tree stump at the crime scene could be associated with the DNA samples provided by David Jacoby. We also disclosed that result to the prosecution right after learning it. Mr. Fedor is now going to talk a little more about the meaning of those DNA results in a little more detail. Tom?
Good morning, everyone. My name is Tom Fedor. I work for the Serological Research Institute in Richmond, California. The Serological Research Institute is often abbreviated for convenience, SERI, SERI. I'll refer to my laboratory as SERI. What I did after Bodie found very important things. Firstly, that none of the DNA from any of the crime scene evidence could be associated with Mr. Echols or Mr. Baldwin or Mr. Miss Kelly, was compare the samples that Mr. Horgan indicated he sent to me to the results that the Bodie laboratory actually got from hairs at the crime scene. What I learned from the cigarette butt that was thought to have been smoked by Terry Hobbs, and I'll say thought to have been because one of them was recovered from the front yard of his residence. Another cigarette butt was recovered from an ashtray in his house. The DNA that I recovered from those cigarette butts does not exclude the person who smoked them from being the source of a particular hair found at the crime scene. That hair was associated with a ligature that bound the victim Moore. Approximately 0.12% of the population could also be the source of that cigarette butt DNA in case there is any doubt about whether it's Hobbs' DNA on that cigarette butt or not. Very few other people could have provided that particular DNA sample. In respect of the hair that was associated with the ligature, approximately 1.5% of the population at large could be the source of that hair. So, what we know now are two things. Terry Hobbs could be the source of that hair on the ligature. None of the defendants could be the source of that hair on the ligature. In respect of items that Mr. Horgan indicated, I tested from David Jacoby. The same sort of result is found. That is, what I have are a cigarette butt thought to have been smoked by him because someone visited his house and collected that cigarette butt. And as Mr. Horgan indicated, Mr. Jacoby generously provided a sample of his cheek swab that I could test. The results from those two samples from Mr. Jacoby were the same as each other, confirming that Jacoby smoked the cigarette butt if there was any question about that. But more importantly, the DNA results from Mr. Jacoby do not exclude him as the source of a hair found on a tree stump or a tree root at the scene of the crime. About 3% of the population could also be the source of the cigarette butt DNA, in case there was any question whether Mr. Jacoby was in fact the smoker of that cigarette. And about 7% of the general population could be responsible for that particular tree stump hair. None of the defendants could have been the source of that hair. None of the victims could have been the source of either hair because, as Mr. Horgan mentioned, Bodie has found none of the DNA evidence from the crime scene connects any of the defendants to the scene of the crime. That's my work. Thank you.
In addition to the DNA, there have been other defense discoveries that bear on the question of actual innocence. As some of you know, a critical prosecution theory at the 1994 trials, and Mr. Reardon mentioned this, was that the defendants used a survival knife to inflict most of the injuries on these victims, and that they used the knife before the children died. In late 2005, the defense hired a pediatric pathologist to review the autopsy reports, the photographs, and other evidence to get her opinion about the cause of the injuries. Her name is Janice Opoven. A few months later, we learned Dr. Opoven's preliminary conclusion, and that was that animals had actually caused most of these wounds and that they had happened after the time that the victims died. And of course, if that were true, it was a very dramatic development because it would expose key elements of the prosecution's case as utter nonsense. So we then consulted with 4 other renowned experts. They included forensic pathologists, Dr. Werner Spitz, who is here today, Michael Baden, Dr. Vincent DeMaio. In addition, forensic odontologist Richard Souveron from Miami-Dade, the medical examiner's office, he's here today, and Dr. Wood from Canada, Robert Wood. The consensus reached by all of those experts was, again, that most of the injuries to the skin of the victims, including the severe genital injury to Christopher Byers, were not caused by the use of a knife, but by animal predation that occurred after death. The experts were also unanimous that none of the children had any injuries consistent with any form of sexual abuse. And as this view was emerging in May of this year, our experts presented those views at a meeting with the prosecution and with Dr. Peretti, who had done the original autopsies, and we all regarded that as a joint search for the truth. Finally, in September of this year, we retained another forensic pathologist, Dr. Terry Haddix from Stanford University, to check on the validity of the animal predation theory and our other experts' views. We gave her all of the relevant background material. We said nothing to her about animal predation whatsoever. And Dr. Haddix concluded that animal predation had explained many of these injuries, that there was no evidence of any sexual abuse, and again, most importantly, that there was no evidence on the children's bodies consistent with the use of a serrated knife. Dr. Spitz and Dr. Souveron are now going to speak for a few minutes about their findings as to the nature and causes of these injuries. One other note before they do begin: we think it's appropriate in this setting to present only very limited photographic views of the injuries in order to illustrate the expert findings. But keep in mind that Dr. Spitz's findings, Dr. Souveron's findings, the finding of every other expert we have, is based on a review of hundreds of autopsy and crime scene photographs, and the most relevant of those photographs and other materials are included in the federal filing that we submitted this past Monday. And with that, I will turn it over to Dr. Spitz, to be followed then immediately by Dr. Souveron.
Good morning. I analyzed, as you heard, a lot of pictures. I analyzed a lot of written material. It is my opinion, or the following are my opinions. Injuries on the body surface of all the 3 victims, 3 boys, including the emasculation of Chris Byers, were produced by animals after death.